We see a town called Colton. We see two children, Daphne and Jake, going into a building and seeing a jail cell. Jake tells Daphne about the curse. He says that's where a man lost his life, and if you get into the cell, it happens to you too. She doesn't believe him, and they dare each other to go inside. Jake gets in and starts acting like he's choking. Daphne runs, saying he's scaring her, and a police officer, their dad, comes in. He tells them to not play in there and to get down. The kids go, and he locks the cell door. He notices a sheriff badge. He takes it and goes down. We see him talking with his wife, Grace. She says that she doesn't want to live in a house with criminals above them. The man, Seth, explains why they must leave, and they hear the door knocking. They see the sheriff when they open it, and Seth asks him how long the inmates are going to stay there, and he responds saying 1 month. Seth turns to Grace and asks what's the worst that can happen. Then we see the inmates moving into the house. They get them upstairs, and they take Waylon to a separate cell in another part where they can't see each other. Then they put Maddie and Donnie in separate cells. Seth goes down and hears the children saying that they are afraid. He tells them to not be afraid and he's there, he'll protect them. The sheriff comes and Seth goes outside with him to talk. He says that they don't need to worry about the inmates since the jail is soundproof. Then we see the inmates talking to each other at night. Stark starts asking Maddie questions, and Donnie starts talking to her. Maddie gets annoyed with him and says she's tired. Then she goes to sleep. Then we see a flashback of Stark coming out of a bar with his girlfriend, but we don't see what happened clearly. Then we see Waylon talking to the drawing of a woman that he made. One police officer comes to bring his breakfast and sees him crying while hugging the wall. Waylon notices this and gets angry at him. He goes to attack him, but he hits his head on the iron bars of the door and falls to the ground. The officer comes in, leaves his food, and gets out after looking at his drawing. He then goes to give the others their food and hears an announcement from the police radio and runs out after locking the cell door. Maddie then goes to sit next to Stark and they start talking. We see Seth looking out of the window and watching his family. Then some dirt from the ceiling falls down to his shoulder and he goes to check upstairs. He sees the inmates fighting and goes in to separate them, but one of them punches him and we see Seth's eyes turning black. Seth then picks up the iron pipe he found on the ground and he hits Donnie's chest with it while yelling at them to break it up. He locks them in and gets out. Then we see him lying on the coffee table. Grace comes in, sees him looking sweaty, and asks if he's okay. He says he's fine and tries to get up, but he passes out. Then we see the previous inmates. We see them fighting, and a drunk policeman comes to hold one of the inmates for others to beat him. The inmate turns around and punches him, causing him to fall to the ground. He continues to hit him, and the other prisoners join him. We see the police's sheriff badge flying into the corner, where Seth had found it. They beat the policeman until he stops moving and his eyes go black. Seth wakes up, and Grace asks if he's okay. He says he's fine, and then we see him going to Waylon's cell. Then we see Donnie going into Maddie's cell. He closes her mouth and she starts screaming. The others wake up, and Stark gets him off of Maddie. They put him back into his cell, and Donnie continues to disturb Maddie. The officer who brings them breakfast comes again, and they tell him to not let Donnie out and explain what he did. Seth wakes up, and Grace gets mad at him for sleeping until noon. Seth hears a sound while they are talking and goes to check it. He sees the officer talking to the sheriff on the phone, explaining what Donnie did. Then we see Stark and Maddie talking about their lives. Stark talks about his girlfriend and says that it's weird how no one is checking on them. Then he says they even might be deceased, and we see Waylon's body in his cell. Then we see Seth having dinner with his family. Daphne says something, and Grace says it's amazing. Then she asks Seth about it, but he doesn't answer. Grace asks multiple times, but he still doesn't answer her. Jake gets up, saying he has a project for tomorrow, and Seth tells him to finish his plate. Jake says he has a project that he has to do, but Seth slaps him. Grace gets up, asking what's wrong with him, and tells Daphne to come closer to her. She gets the kids out, saying he's going to eat alone. We see everyone except Pablo, one of the inmates, sleeping, and Seth going up the stairs. Pablo sees Seth choking Donnie with the iron bar, and he hides. Seth tells him to keep quiet while he drags Donnie's body away. Seth takes him to the basement, and we see Sheriff coming in the morning, seeing Seth asleep on the porch. He wakes him up and goes to check the inmates. He doesn't realize Waylon's no longer alive and Donnie's missing. Seth wakes up to Grace throwing her bag to the ground. She says that they are leaving for some time, and they turn around to get out. Seth stops Jake, but he doesn't say anything. Daphne comes back and hugs him. We see the sheriff talking to Stark about his release. He says that nobody called them about it. Then we see Grace helping the kids to get into the car. She then says something to Seth, but he looks at the dog that's trying to open the basement door instead of listening to her. He notices and asks her what she said, but Grace says it's nothing and gets into the car. We see Seth going to the basement after they leave. We see him going back to the house, and the sheriff comes to talk to him. Seth tells him that his wife left him, and the sheriff says he'll get them out of there as soon as possible. He leaves, and Seth goes upstairs. He gets Cash, Stark, and Maddie out. He takes them to a cell with paint and brushes, and tells them to paint the walls. He locks them in there and leaves. Seth goes to Pablo and threatens him. We see the officer bringing them food while Seth talks to Pablo. Seth hides when he comes in. The officer asks Pablo where the others are, and Pablo says he doesn't know. He gets anxious and starts yelling at the officer. Pablo takes his gun and points it at him. The officer tries to convince him to not shoot him by saying he has a wife and children. Pablo points the gun at himself. The others hear the gunshot and look at each other. The officer runs to Pablo, and Seth comes out, laughing. The officer looks at him in shock, and Seth hits him with the iron pipe. He falls to the ground, and Seth keeps hitting. Then we see him cleaning up the blood. He goes and lets the others out. Cash asks where Pablo is, and Seth says he doesn't know. Then we see Seth in the kitchen, mixing something to the drinks he prepared. When the sheriff knocks on the door, Seth opens the door, and they start talking. The sheriff looks suspicious, and asks him if he saw the officer. Seth says he came, they talked, and he left. Sheriff asks if he can come in. Seth doesn't allow him, and closes the door. He goes back to the drinks, but someone knocks on the door again. He gets a knife and goes to open it. He sees the guy who he talked to about a new house, and he sends him away too. Seth gets the drinks and goes upstairs. He gives the drinks to them, but Cash doesn't want to drink it. Seth gets mad, and pours the one he didn't add anything to on the ground. Stark gets one of the drinks and downs it. Seth argues with Cash and gets out. We see Maddie watching Stark and Cash talking, and she slowly loses consciousness. She falls to the ground, and Cash notices Stark's not okay. He asks him what happened, but Stark passes out too before he can answer. We see Seth coming up the stairs, hitting the iron pipe on the metal around him. We see Cash shaking and praying when he comes. Seth goes to open the door, and Cash hides. He attacks Seth from behind. Seth gets startled at first, but he manages to throw Cash off of him and hits him with the pipe. Then he gets him on the ground and starts choking him. Then we see Seth waking up on the couch. Stark wakes up too, and he goes to Maddie. She wakes up, and they start talking about what happened to them. They understand that there was something in the drinks. Stark holds Maddie's hand through the iron bars, and Seth comes. He says he's sorry for ruining their moment, but they need to go. He takes Maddie with him downstairs, and gives Stark something to clean the toilet. Maddie asks why she's there when they go downstairs, and Seth says she's there to make him breakfast. Maddie laughs, and asks if he's kidding her. Seth gets angry and grabs her by her hair. He gets her face close to the burning pan and threatens her. Maddie gets scared and says okay, she will do it. Seth sits down, and Maddie starts preparing breakfast. She looks at the knife in her hand while she butters the toast, and Seth asks if it's ready yet. Maddie gives him the plate while hiding the knife behind her, and he starts eating. She then turns around and cuts his arm. Maddie gets out and starts running around and yelling for help. Seth comes out and drags her into the basement, locking her in. He takes a piece of fabric and bandages his wound. Then he hears Maddie's laugh when he is about to go upstairs, and he turns back to go to the basement, but we see the furniture in the house disappearing. He gets into the basement and sees the painting of a lady with black eyes. He gets scared, tosses the flashlight, and gets out of there. He goes to Stark and gets into the cell. They start fighting and hitting each other. Stark gets him on the ground and chokes him, but Seth gets up. They continue to hit each other, but Stark finally gets him on the ground again. He chokes Seth with a pillow and suffocates him. He throws himself to the ground and turns to look at him, but sees his girlfriend instead. Then he gets a flashback of that night he didn't fully remember. They go to the bar, and he sees everyone in that house in the bar that night. They get out of the bar and start walking. Then they stop in front of the house, and Stark tells the house's story to his girlfriend. He tries to convince her to get into the house, and she finally accepts. Then we see him crying and hugging his girlfriend's body. He tries to open the cell door but sees that it's locked. We see the sheriff's badge on the ground, where Seth had picked it up. Stark yells for help, but no one hears him. The movie ends there.